Yesterday, Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, introduced the Job Keeper Subsidy. This is $1,500 per fortnight or $75 per week. The objective of the Job Keeper Subsidy is to provide money to firms so that they can retain employees so that when the end of the COVID-19 epidemic is in sight, that those workers can go back to work full-time and there'll be a rapid rebound in the Australian economy. The total costs of this Job Keeper Subsidy is 130 billion Australian dollars over 6 months, or $19,500 per worker. When I look at those two numbers and divide the total cost of the program of $130 billion by that 19,500, I can see that the program assumes that there will be 6.7 million Australian workers at risk. And the purpose of the program is to keep those people in employment and ready to come back full time. The most recent numbers we have from the Australian Bureau of Statistics is that there are 13 million people employed in Australia. So that 6.7 million people is 52% of all of the people with jobs in this country. So clearly the government saw those people at risk of losing employment. So far, the government has undertaken 3 programs. At the beginning of February, we said that we thought the total impact on the Australian economy then was from the reduction of Chinese tourism and the slump in fourth-year education because of the lack of Chinese students. And we thought at that time the impact would be 1% of Australian GDP. We later reduced this to 0.75% of 1% of GDP, 0.75% of GDP. And in response to that, or following that, the government introduced a stimulus package of 17.6 billion Australian dollars, which is about 0.9% of Australian GDP, pretty much the same estimate that we had of the potential loss. And what we said then was that the government was acting to fill the potholes in the road ahead of the movement of the Australian economy so that we could drive smoothly over these problems. Then the government introduced a second stimulus package of 66 billion Australian dollars, or 3.3% of GDP. Now, what this was the increase in the Job Seeker Allowance, and the Job Seeker Allowance was previously replaced New Start, what we think of as unemployment benefit. The point being here is that the people who were going on unemployment were going through no fault of their own, and they needed a high enough income to support themselves through the crisis before new employment would be available. Now, the total size of this impact was 3.3% of GDP. Now we have the Job Keeper Allowance, and that is a total of 130 billion Australian dollars, or 6.5% of GDP. This is another pothole in the road, a significant pothole in the road which the government is filling ahead of the movement of the Australian economy. If we add up these 3 subsidies, they total 213.6 billion Australian dollars, or 10.7% of GDP. Now, what this says to us is that the government thought that absent these actions, then you would have a fall in Australian output of 10.7% of Australian GDP, which they now have filled. Even so, we've revised our estimates for the Australian economy and growth in GDP. We think that for the financial year 2019 to 2020, that the Australian economy, because of the big slump in output which we see coming in the second calendar quarter, the final quarter of the financial year, we see output falling between 4 and 5% in that quarter. We think that year-on-year growth rate will be minus 2.5%. What we then see is a pretty rapid acceleration of Australian growth in the third calendar quarter and the fourth calendar quarter. And that rapid acceleration should take output for the full year up to a positive 0.5%. That means that the acceleration in the second year will take up all of the losses of the first part of the year. I think that's particularly true in financial markets. The US economy will be coming to the end of its epidemic, according to Anthony Fauci, who's the head of the National Institute of Diseases and Allergies, and he says that the end of July should be the end of the epidemic. So after that, the US economy should be coming back. US financial markets should be extremely healthy, and we should see a recovery in financial markets and capital flows and foreign investment in the Australian economy. So therefore we think there will be a dramatic acceleration in the second half. So we think for the full year we should have a positive GDP growth or just positive GDP growth of 0.5%. In the immediate future, the Australian economy will be weak for the next quarter, but what we see is significant recovery in the second half of the year as we move ahead.